Yeah.
So the other thread that's interesting, I mean, there's kind of three different pieces to me that are interesting about Castro that, one is just the sort of innate reality, and it's kind of morally neutral, that this guy who ran a small island of relatively just literally geographic and geopolitically, it's small. It doesn't have that much weight to throw around. And somehow, for decades, this was a historically influential figure. That's just kind of fascinating in of itself. Number two, and I think it's important to hold a balanced and full view of his legacy. And of course, he committed some human rights abuses and things that I wouldn't like or approve of. But it was fascinating to me to notice a couple of months ago, or actually maybe at this point, it's a year ago, when King Abdullah died. The Times and all these other places put out these very contextual obituaries of this was a guy who presided over the Saudi system. He did implement some kind of modest reforms, and then they would quote Dennis Ross or people like that to say he was a great reformer. Meanwhile, just by definition, overseeing the Saudi system means that you support gender apartheid, beheadings. I mean, if you're just talking on that pure human rights level, like the way we detail it by Amnesty International. So it's stunning that we can't even at this point, even after an opening, have a holistic and full view of Castro. And then the third thing that I think is very important in this moment, I know you've already touched on, but I think you can also speak to the global dimension of it. This was also someone who earned an enormous amount of popularity in the Caribbean, among African Americans, and in Africa because he was literally, and again, coming from an incredibly small power base, a fighter against colonialism and racism globally, not just in his own society. And if we're going to have a full accounting of him, Nelson Mandela making one of his first trips to Cuba after he was, released from prison and apartheid was being dismantled, that has to be on the ledger too.
Each of your points, very, very important and also quite eloquent. Let me just start with the first one, because your reference to the Saudis is so on the money. The problem, what irritates the U.S. about Cuba is actually two things. One is that the Cuban movement, Cuban Revolution, challenged property relations.
Right.
And property relations are sacred for the United States. And touching
and the Saudis.
Sorry, that's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So touching them is what brings the wrath of the U.S. dollar on you. And that's what we saw. It was not about how many people were executed in the beginning. I mean, the executions were targeted at mafiosi, at torturers, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. That's not what they're concerned about. They're concerned about property relations. But the other thing that irritated the hell out of the United States about Cuba, just as it did Haiti, was that here you had this country that wasn't just small, but it was brown and black. And they had basically thumbed their nose at the United States. And you just don't do that, right? You just don't do that. The Haitians kicked out the French and have never been forgiven for that. And the Cubans dared to turn their country from being a whorehouse and casino into a country that's had a major impact on the world. And the U.S. has never forgiven them for that. And now we hear President-elect Trump and his crew discussing in very threatening ways, very threatening tones, that they will want more concessions from Cuba and changes, etc. But it goes fundamentally back to property and race.
And they want to bring the Batista-style governance to the United States itself. I mean, I think...
That's the way it feels.
Yeah, it's absolutely the way it feels. And I think the last thing I'll say on it for me is I think if everybody, and I'm an admitted Godfather head, but if everybody can watch Godfather 2 and watch the Cuba sequence and realize that is a perfect distillation of, again, for all of his many imperfections. That's what Castro was overthrowing. It was
Yes.
a mafia state that literally on the rooftop of a hotel in Havana, these guys are slicing a cake up that symbolizes the entire Cuban economy. And it was all in concert with the U.S. government, the CIA, all of the major multinationals operating in Cuba, and the mafia. That's real. That is like
Yeah.
one of the most politically, historically accurate sequences in film. That's what he was overthrowing.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I think, to go into your another point that you were raising, so the Cuban Revolution, in thumbing its nose at the United States, did something more than that. It wasn't just rhetorical. They provided incredible assistance to national liberation movements around the world. They provided medical assistance to countless countries. In fact, as you may remember, when we had Hurricane Katrina, they offered assistance to the United States because they have an immense amount of experience with hurricanes. And they offered to help, and the United States turned Cuba and Venezuela down. After they made their respective offers, they trained doctors from all over the world. I mean, how many countries do this? And so, yes, there are criticisms that absolutely can be made of the Cuban system, of the late Fidel Castro. I, for one, believe in term limits.
Right.
And I mean, I just do. And I actually had that discussion once with some Cubans. But it's their system, last time I checked.
Right.
And the U.S. does not have the moral standing, please, it just doesn't, to make the kinds of criticisms that they're making. It's just interesting. Here's a historical note. So I've been in these discussions, and people talk, well, all these people left Cuba. Okay. Now, in 1783, when the U.S. became independent, there were thousands and thousands of people that left the United States.
Right.
But we don't talk about that. We act as if that was sort of irrelevant, if it happened at all. We have this complete myth about the origin of the United States. Thousands of people left. They migrated to Canada, or they migrated to the Caribbean. In some cases went back to Britain, but they left. The fact that people left Cuba after the revolution should not have been any kind of surprise. And then when you add on to that, it's a poor country, and beginning in the 1980s, you'd have people leaving primarily for economic reasons.
Right.
But that's not different than people leaving Mexico for economic reasons.
Right. That got conflated in terms of exactly that a lot of people were leaving many economically challenging circumstances across the Latin America as well as many other places, in fact. And, they were, at least in Cuba, there was good public infrastructure and health spending. So, I just think it's very important, and I'm glad that we got a chance to talk about this.
Hey, it's Sam Seder. Why don't you subscribe to this channel? You can do so right over here. Subscribe.